Good evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome back to Vampire Read-Throughs, where we don't just read through a seminal work of classic vampire fiction, but we also read through it, because I talk about it and explain it to you and stuff while we read. I don't know. It sounded deeper in my head. Tonight, we continue with the prototypical lesbian vampire trope beginner herself, Carmilla. Last we left off, Laura had been having some interesting, I don't want to call them dreams, but sleep experiences. So she keeps having these dream states where she hears voices and she sees things. She wakes up and she sees a cat in her room, a giant black cat, not a wolf. No, wolves are for male vampires because boys are for dogs and girls are for cats, right? Isn't that what they say? Because, animal preferences are gendered. Ever since the Victorian times. And she sees a figure at the foot of her bed, drenched in blood. She feels 2 needles piercing her breast because, this vampire doesn't go for the throat. No, she goes straight for the bosom. And when she told her best gal pal Carmilla about these dreams, Carmilla said, "Oh, you should use that anti-vampire charm that's soaked in drugs. That'll help you sleep better." Yeah, that won't make it easier for a vampire to prey on you at all. But as these experiences went on and Laura grew weaker and weaker every day, from the blood loss, she thought, surely I don't have the same weakening, wasting sickness that all the girls in the village and the forest have that sounds exactly like this after they felt like they got attacked just like I got attacked. No, not me. I wouldn't want to worry my family with that. Oh no, that'd be too horrible. It's just, I'm fine. Really, I'm fine. So she doesn't tell anyone what's happening. And then one night, her dream voices say, "Your mother says beware the assassin." So Laura's ghost mother from beyond the grave, who she lost as a small child, has spoken to some sort of medium who is now telling Laura that mother says beware the assassin. And instead of Laura thinking, "Oh no, all these horrible experiences are killing me," she thinks, "Oh no, an assassin is going to kill Carmilla," which isn't that far-fetched because Carmilla did tell her tragic backstory of how she was almost assassinated in her bed one night when she was, human or, 16 or whatever Laura thinks she was. Because Carmilla's only supposed to be Laura's age, 19. How long ago could it possibly have been? So Laura jumps out of bed, runs over to Carmilla's room, but it's locked. So she has people break down the door and say, "Carmilla, are you okay?" But Carmilla is gone. Chapter 8, Search. By the way, the fact that none of you have noticed my awesome bookmarks so far, very disappointed. At sight of the room, perfectly undisturbed except for our violent entrance, we began to cool a little, and soon recovered our senses sufficiently to dismiss the men. It had struck Mademoiselle that possibly Carmilla had been wakened by the uproar at her door, and in her first panic had jumped from her bed and hid herself in a press or behind a curtain, from which she could not, of course, emerge until the major domo and his myrmidons had withdrawn. Myrmidons. I have never heard that word before. That is an awesome word. So, of course, Carmilla can't come out from behind the curtains, not in her jammies, no. But send all the men away, then she'll come out, then it will be okay. We now recommenced our search and began to call her by name again. It was all to no purpose. Our perplexity and agitation increased. We examined the windows, but they were secured. I implored of Carmilla, if she had concealed herself, to play this cruel trick no longer, to come out, and to end our anxieties. It was all useless. I was by this time convinced that she was not in the room, nor in the dressing room, the door of which was still locked on this side. She could not have passed it. I was utterly puzzled. Had Carmilla discovered one of those secret passages which the old housekeeper said were known to exist in the Schloss, although the tradition of their exact situation had been lost? A little time would, no doubt, explain all, utterly perplexed as for the present we were. It was past 4 o'clock, and I preferred passing the remaining hours of darkness in Madame's room. Daylight brought no solution of the difficulty. The whole household, with my father at its head, was in a state of agitation the next morning. Every part of the chateau was searched. The grounds were explored. Not a trace of the missing lady could be discovered. The stream was about to be dragged. My father was in distraction. Oh no, not distraction. The most suffering of Victorian maladies. What a tale to have to tell the poor girl's mother on her return. I, too, was almost beside myself, though my grief was quite of a different kind. The morning was passed in alarm and excitement. What, you're not going to tell us what your grief was? So her father is upset because he's afraid he's going to have to tell this girl's mother, yeah, she just disappeared one night and we don't know what happened to your daughter. Sorry. But Laura's grief is of a different kind, so I guess she just misses Carmilla. She's afraid the assassin got her. Is it because she secretly hearts her after all? Or is it because, she's been having horrible nightmare visions and stuff that she won't tell her father about? So I'm sure she didn't tell her father about the whole assassin thing. So she probably feels a little guilty too, and yet she's still not saying anything because she doesn't want her father to worry about her. No, we can only worry about Carmilla. The morning was passed in alarm and excitement. It was now 1 o'clock, and still no tidings. I ran up to Carmilla's room and found her standing at her dressing table. I was astounded. I could not believe my eyes. She beckoned me to her with her pretty finger in silence. Her face expressed extreme fear. So wait, what made Laura run up to Carmilla's room at 1 o'clock? What's like 1 o'clock the time that Carmilla usually woke up? Well, she ran up there and Carmilla was there and Carmilla looked scared. I ran to her in an ecstasy of joy. I kissed and embraced her again and again. I ran to the bell and rang it vehemently to bring others to the spot who might at once relieve my father's anxiety. Dear Carmilla, what has become of you all this time? We have been in agonies of anxiety about you, I exclaimed. Where have you been? How did you come back? Last night has been a night of wonders, she said. For mercy's sake, explain all you can. It was past 2 last night, she said. When I went to sleep, as usual, in my bed, with my doors locked, that of the dressing room and the opening upon the gallery. My sleep was uninterrupted and, so far as I know, dreamless. But I awoke just now on the sofa in the dressing room there, and I found the door between the rooms open and the other door forced. How could all this have happened without my being wakened? It must have been accompanied with a great deal of noise, and I am particularly easily wakened. And how could I have been carried out of my bed without my sleep having been interrupted? I, whom the slightest stir startles. By this time, Madame and Mademoiselle, my father, and a number of servants were in the room. Carmilla was, of course, overwhelmed with inquiries, congratulations, and welcomes. She had but one story to tell and seemed the least able of all party to suggest any way of accounting for what had happened. That's a good con artist trick. She tells a story like, oh, I woke up in my dressing room, which you guys found locked from the outside, so you didn't assume I could have been in there. But that's where I woke up, and the door was mysteriously opened, and, the other door is forced open, and I don't know what happened. And then you just be quiet and wait for someone else to offer an explanation and then go along with whatever they offer and, they'll buy your story that way. My father took a turn up and down the room thinking. I saw Carmilla's eye follow him for a moment with a sly, dark glance. When my father had sent the servants away, Mademoiselle having gone in search of a little bottle of valerian and salvotal, those are like smelling salts, and there being no one now in the room with Carmilla except my father, Madame, and myself, he came to her thoughtfully, took her hand very kindly, and led her to the sofa, and sat down beside her. Will you forgive me, my dear, if I risk a conjecture and ask a question? Who can have a better right? She said. Ask what you please, and I will tell you everything, but my story is simply one of bewilderment and darkness. I know absolutely nothing. Put any question you please, but you know, of course, the limitations Mamma has placed me under. Laura just saw Carmilla watching Dad with his sly, dark glance, but then she doesn't say anything else about the sly, dark glance. She just kind of notices it and lets it go. That's interesting. You know the limitations Mamma has placed me under. Perfectly, my child. I need not approach the topics on which she desires our silence. Now, the marvel of last night consists of your having been removed from your bed and your room without being wakened, and this removal having occurred apparently while the windows were still secured and the 2 doors locked upon the inside. I will tell you my theory, and first ask you a question." Carmilla was leaning on her hand dejectedly. Madame and I were listening breathlessly. How do you lean on your hand dejectedly? Like this? "Now my question is this. Have you ever been walking in your sleep?" "Never, since I was very young indeed." "But you did walk in your sleep when you were young?" "Yes, I know I did. I have been told so often by my nurse." My father smiled and nodded. "Oh, Dad thinks he's so slick. Dad thinks he's a detective. Yeah, Dad's like, oh, look at me, I'm Sherlock Holmes. Well, what has happened is this. You got up in your sleep, unlocked the door, not leaving the key as usual in the lock, but taking it out and locking it on the outside. You again took the key out and carried it away with you to some one of the 25 rooms on this floor, or perhaps upstairs or downstairs. There are so many rooms and closets, so much heavy furniture, and such accumulations of lumber that it would require a week to search this old house thoroughly. Do you see now what I mean?" "I do, but not all," she answered. "And how, Papa, do you account for her finding herself on the sofa in the dressing room, which we had searched so carefully?" "She came there after you had searched it, still in her sleep, and at last awoke spontaneously, and was as much surprised to find herself where she was as anyone else. I wish all mysteries were so easily and innocently explained as yours, Carmilla," he said, laughing. Oh my God, this guy is so full of himself. Yes, that explains her mystery perfectly, my man. Yeah, the irony. You're too British to understand, to believe in the supernatural. Where did she really go? Vampire places. For vampire reasons. We know that. But there's a chance that readers, in oldie times, when this was originally serialized, might have been on the father's side. Might have been reading this and being like, yeah, Dad, oh, you're smart. I thought the same thing. I'm smart too. Ha, ha, ha. Because although they know that this is a ghost story, because that's what Le Fanu was famous for, they don't know it's a vampire story. Vampire stories weren't a big deal yet. They had Varney the Vampire and all these sort of like cheap, penny dreadful sort of things. But this would have still been a mystery that to someone at that time could have been surprising. Not like us reading it now. It's like, duh, of course she's a vampire, because we're already familiar with all those tropes. Don't you sometimes wish you lived back then when ideas like this were brand new and you could have really actually been surprised by them and excited by them and been like, oh, this new sort of awesome, lesbian, beautiful monster is blowing my mind. I've never seen anything like this before. Good times. And so we may congratulate ourselves on the certainty that the most natural explanation of the occurrence is the one that involves no drugging, no tampering with locks, no burglars or poisoners or witches, nothing that need alarm Carmilla or anyone else for our safety. Carmilla was looking charmingly. Nothing could be more beautiful than her tints. Her beauty was, I think, enhanced by that graceful languor that was peculiar to her. I think my father was silently contrasting her looks with mine, for he said, I wish my poor Laura was looking more like herself, and he sighed. So our alarms were happily ended, and Carmilla restored to her friends. Nice Laura. She's just like, oh, Carmilla just looks so hot right then. It was great. I, of course, look like crap, you know. He's just like, I wish you looked as good as Carmilla. You know, after, 3 weeks now of Laura suffering nightmares and blood loss? Not that she would have told her father any of that, of course, you know. She's too good of a person to ever trouble anyone else with her own troubles. I think that's interesting about her character, actually. She's this sort of martyr, self-sacrificing young lady now when she describes herself as a child as being really spoiled and selfish and needy, and she grew out of that. That's kind of cool. Because, you know, she didn't have any influence on her to particularly make her grow out of that. She just did it naturally and turned into this sweet, sweet person. Chapter 9, The Doctor. As Carmilla would not hear of an attendant sleeping in her room, my father arranged that a servant should sleep outside her door, so that she could not attempt to make another such excursion without being arrested at her own door. That night passed quietly. And next morning early, the doctor, whom my father had sent for without telling me a word about it, arrived to see me. Oh, well, it's nice Dad is actually doing something now about Laura's wasting sickness. He noticed it on his own. Madame accompanied me to the library, and there the grave little doctor with white hair and spectacles, who I mentioned before, was waiting to receive me. I told him my story, And as I proceeded, he grew graver and graver. We were standing, he and I, in the recess of one of the windows, facing one another. When my statement was over, he leaned with his shoulders against the wall and with his eyes fixed on me earnestly, with an interest in which was a dash of horror. After a minute's reflection, he asked Madame if he could see my father. He was sent for accordingly, and he entered, smiling. He said, "I dare say, doctor, you are going to tell me that I am an old fool for having brought you here. I hope I am." But his smile faded into shadow as the doctor, with a very grave face, beckoned him to him. He and the doctor talked for some time in the same recess where I had just conferred with the physician. It seemed an earnest and argumentative conversation. The room was very large, and I and Madame stood together, burning with curiosity at the further end. Not a word could we hear, however, for they spoke in very low tone, and the deep recess of the window quite concealed the doctor from view, and very nearly my father, whose foot, arm, and shoulder only we could see. And the voices were, I suppose, all the less audible for the sort of closet which the thick wall and window formed. Now, Laura, that's a whole lot of description to explain why you can't overhear what they're talking about. After a time, my father's face looked into the room. It was pale, thoughtful, and, I fancied, agitated. "Laura, dear, come here for a moment. Madame, we shan't trouble you, the doctor says, at present." Accordingly, I approached, for the first time a little alarmed, for, although I felt very weak, I did not feel ill, and strength, one always fancies, is a thing that may be picked up when we please. My father held out his hand to me as I drew near, but he was looking at the doctor, and he said, "It certainly is very odd. I don't understand it quite. Laura, come here, dear. Now attend to Dr. Spielsberg and recollect yourself. You mentioned a sensation like that of 2 needles piercing your skin, somewhere about your neck, on the night when you experienced your first horrible dream. Is there still any soreness?" "None at all," I answered. "Can you indicate with your finger about the point at which you think this occurred?" "Very little below my throat. Here," I answered. I wore a morning dress which covered the place I pointed to. Now they're talking about it on her neck. When she talked about before, it was on her breast. I don't know. Maybe this whole area is her breast. So, you got the neck, got the throat. You just kind of hear there's a lot of collarbones there. So I don't know where the fangs would go in, but vampire magic. "Now you can satisfy yourself," said the doctor. "You won't mind your papa's lowering your dress a very little. It is necessary to detect a symptom of the complaint under which you have been suffering." I acquiesced. It was only an inch or 2 below the edge of my collar. "God bless me, so it is!" exclaimed my father, growing pale. "You see it now with your own eyes," said the doctor, with a gloomy triumph. "What is it?" I exclaimed, beginning to be frightened. "Nothing, my dear young lady, but a small blue spot about the size of the tip of your little finger. And now," he continued, turning to Papa, "the question is, what is best to be done?" "Is there any danger?" I urged in great trepidation. "I trust not, my dear," answered the doctor. "I don't see why you should not recover. I don't see why you should not begin immediately to get better. That is the point at which the sense of strangulation begins?" "Yes," I answered. "And recollect as well you can, the same point was a kind of center of that thrill which you described just now, like the current of a cold stream running against you?" "It may have been. I think it was." "Aye, you see," he added, turning to my father. "Shall I say a word to Madame?" "Certainly," said my father. He called Madame to him and said, "I find my young friend here far from well. It won't be of any great consequence, I hope, but it will be necessary that some steps be taken, which I will explain by and by. But in the meantime, Madame, you will be so good as to not let Miss Laura be alone for 1 moment. That is the only direction I need give for the present. It is indispensable." "We may rely upon your kindness, Madame, I know," added my father. Madame satisfied him eagerly. "And you, dear Laura, I know you will observe the doctor's direction. I shall have to ask your opinion upon another patient whose symptoms slightly resemble those of my daughter that have just been detailed to you, very much milder in degree, but I believe quite of the same sort. She is a young lady, our guest, but as you say you will be passing this way again this evening, you can't do better than to take your supper here, and you can then see her. She does not come down till afternoon." "I thank you," said the doctor. "I shall be with you then at about 7 this evening." And then they repeated their directions to me and to Madame, and with this parting charge my father left us and walked out with the doctor, and I saw them pacing together up and down between the road and the moat in the grassy platform in front of the castle, evidently absorbed in earnest conversation. So now that the doctors finally come to see our poor wasting victim, and he notices the mark on her throat, not 2 puncture wounds, but a small blue bruise-looking mark, he tells her, yes, this will start going away immediately once we enact our precautions. And the first precaution is never be alone. And Laura and her Madame governess say that they will do this. And this is the exact same advice that Professor Van Helsing comes and brings in Dracula. And knowing that Bram Stoker most certainly was influenced by this, we can't help seeing the similarities between this scene and the arrival of Professor Van Helsing and Dracula. With Lucy noticing the marks on her neck, he says she must always have someone sitting in her room with her, and then he starts putting the garlic and stuff around. And he doesn't at first tell anyone why, just like this doctor is not telling anyone why, though we can suspect that perhaps he told the father, and that's why she goes to such great pains to explain why she couldn't hear what he was telling the father. So that way Laura remains a mystery. The reader remains a mystery, and we can keep going a little longer before we figure out what could the problem possibly be. The doctor did not return. I saw him mount his horse there and take his leave and ride away eastward through the forest. Nearly at the same time, I saw a man arrive from Dranfeld with the letters and dismount and hand the bag to my father. In the meantime, Madame and I were both busy, lost in conjecture as to the reason of the singular and earnest direction which the doctor and my father had concurred in imposing. Madame, as she afterwards told me, was afraid the doctor apprehended a sudden seizure, and that without prompt assistance I might either lose my life in a fit or at least be seriously hurt. The interpretation did not strike me, and I fancied, perhaps luckily for my nerves, that the arrangement was prescribed simply to secure a companion who would prevent my taking too much exercise or eating unripe fruit or doing any of the 50 foolish things to which young people are supposed to be prone. So Laura isn't even taking this prescription seriously. So it's not just that she didn't want to worry her family with her sickness. She doesn't even believe it herself. Laura, you're doing that British thing again. You were supposed to be the smart one. About half an hour after my father came in, he had a letter in his hand and said, "This letter has been delayed. It is from General Spielsdorf. He might have been here yesterday. He may not come till tomorrow, or he may be here today." He put the open letter into my hand, but he did not look pleased, as he used to when a guest, especially one so loved as the general, was coming. On the contrary, he looked as if he wished him at the bottom of the Red Sea. There was plainly something on his mind which he did not choose to divulge. "Papa, darling, will you tell me this?" said I, suddenly laying my hand on his arm and looking, I am sure, imploringly in his face. "Perhaps," he answered, smoothing my hair caressingly over my eyes. "Does the doctor think me very ill?" "No, dear. He thinks if right steps are taken, you will be quite well again, at least on the high road to a complete recovery in a day or two," he answered a little dryly. "I wish our good friend the general had chosen any other time. That is, I wish you had been perfectly well to receive him." "But do tell me, Papa," I insisted. "What does he think the matter is with me?" "Nothing. You must not plague me with questions," he answered, with more irritation than I ever remember him to have displayed before. And seeing that I looked wounded, I suppose, he kissed me and added, "You shall know all about it in a day or two. That is, all that I know. In the meantime, you are not to trouble your head about it." He turned and left the room, but came back before I had done wondering and puzzling over the oddity of all this. It was merely to say that he was going to Karnstein, and had ordered the carriage to be ready at 12, and that I and Madame should accompany him. He was going to see the priest who lived near those picturesque grounds upon business, and as Carmilla had never seen them, she could follow when she came down with Mademoiselle, who would bring materials for what you call a picnic, which might be laid for us in the ruined castle. Oh yes, materials for what you would call a picnic. We wouldn't call it a picnic. I don't know what you'd call it. She doesn't tell us, but... So they are going to the old ruined Karnstein castle for her dad to see a priest near there, to ask him a question that he won't tell Laura what it's about, but they're going to have a nice picnic when they get there. At 12 o'clock accordingly, I was ready, and not long after my father, Madame, and I set out upon our projected drive. Passing the drawbridge, we turned to the right and followed the road over the steep Gothic bridge westward to reach the deserted village and the ruined castle of Karnstein. No sylvan drive can be fancied prettier. The ground breaks into gentle hills and hollows, all clothed with beautiful woods, totally destitute of the comparative formality which artificial planting and early culture and pruning impart. See, because they live in Styria, not England. In England, the grounds are always like manicured and stuff, but here it's wild, so mysterious, but beautiful in a mysterious way. The irregularities of the ground often led the road out of its course and caused it to wind beautifully round the sides of broken hollows and the steeper sides of the hills among varieties of ground almost inexhaustible. Turning one of these points, we suddenly encountered our old friend the general riding towards us, attended by a mounted servant. His portmanteaus were followed in a hired wagon, such as we term a cart. We had a meal, which you would call a picnic. He had a wagon, which we would call a cart. The general dismounted as we pulled up, and, after the usual greetings, was easily persuaded to accept the vacant seat in the carriage and send his horse on with the servant to the Schloss. So, as you may recall from part 1 of our reading, the general is the parent of the young lady, Bertha, who is going to come visit Laura back at the beginning of the story, but she couldn't because she died. And the general sent a very distracted letter about how she was victim to some fiend and he was going to go hunt this fiend down, and he wasn't going to be coming back to see them again until he had hunted this fiend down and gotten the information he needed. And then he sent a letter saying he was coming, but it got delayed in the mail. So now he just shows up out of the blue. And what's he going to do after this arduous hunt for this fiend who destroyed his poor ward, his poor child, poor Bertha, who died in innocence and didn't know she was preyed upon? What's he going to do? Go on a picnic. Chapter 10, Bereaved. It was about 10 months since we had last seen him, but that time had sufficed to make an alteration of years in his appearance. He had grown thinner. Something of gloom and anxiety had taken the place of that cordial serenity which used to characterize his features. His dark blue eyes, always penetrating, now gleamed with a sterner light from under his shaggy gray eyebrows. It was not such a change as grief alone usually induces, and angrier passions seem to have had their share in bringing it about. So he's not just sad. He's angry. He's mad about being sad. We had not long resumed our drive when the general began to talk, with his usual soldierly directness, of the bereavement, as he termed it, which he had sustained in the death of his beloved niece and ward. And then he broke out in a tone of intense bitterness and fury, inveighing against the hellish arts to which she had fallen a victim, and expressing with more exasperation than piety his wonder that heaven should tolerate so monstrous an indulgence in the lusts and malignity of hell. Oh, how blasphemous! My father, who saw at once that something very extraordinary had befallen, asked him, if not too painful to him, to detail the circumstances which he thought justified the strong terms in which he expressed himself. I should tell you all with pleasure, said the general, but you would not believe me. Why should I not? He asked. Because, he answered testily, you believe in nothing but what consists of your own prejudices and illusions. I remember when I was like you, but I have learned better. Try me, said my father. I am not such a dogmatist as you suppose, besides which I very well know that you generally require proof for what you believe, and am, therefore, very strongly predisposed to respect your conclusions. You are right in supposing that I have not been led lightly into a belief in the marvelous, for what I have experienced is marvelous, and I have been forced by extraordinary evidence to credit that which ran counter diametrically to all my theories. I've been made the dupe of a preternatural conspiracy. Notwithstanding his professions of confidence in the general's penetration, I saw my father, at this point, glance at the general with, as I thought, a marked suspicion of his sanity. The general did not see it, luckily. He was looking gloomily and curiously into the glades and vistas of the woods that were opening before us. You are going to the ruins of Karnstein? He asked. Yes, it is a lucky coincidence. Do you know I was going to ask you to bring me there to inspect them? I have a special object in exploring. There is a ruined chapel, ain't there? Ain't there? It says ain't there. Is that for real? You know, I've noticed a few typos in this book, like the word the being missing, or, you know, tiny things that makes me wonder if the editor of this book typed up this whole story from some other text instead of just copying and pasting it off of Project Gutenberg or something, which is what I would have done if I was making an anthology. But I don't remember the word ain't ever being in Carmilla before. I'm going to cross-reference this. Hold that thought. Pause the story. Let's see. It says it here too. It says, ain't there? There is a ruined chapel, ain't there, with a great many tombs of that extinct family? I mean, the general, I assume, with a name like Spielsdorf, I assume he's a native to Styria, unlike Laura and her father. But I wonder if he's supposed to be speaking in some kind of German dialect, or would they be speaking German? I know they speak German, I know they speak French, and they speak English, but she only speaks English with her father, so they're probably speaking German with this guy. Ain't a, like, German colloquialism thing that I'm just unfamiliar with? You'll learn something new every time you read a Gothic story. There's a ruined chapel, ain't there, with a great many tombs of that extinct family? So there are. Highly interesting, said my father. I hope you are thinking of claiming the title and estates? My father said this gaily, but the general did not recollect the laugh, or even the smile which courtesy exacts for a friend's joke. On the contrary, he looked grave and even fierce, ruminating on a matter that stirred his anger and horror. Something very different, he said gruffly. I mean to unearth some of those fine people. I hope by God's blessing to accomplish a pious sacrilege here which will relieve our earth of certain monsters and enable honest people to sleep in their beds without being assailed by murderers. I have strange things to tell you, my dear friend, such as I myself would have scouted as incredible a few months since. There's that word strange again. Does he have gay things to tell him? Lesbian things? My father looked at him again, but this time not with a glance of suspicion, with an eye, rather, of keen intelligence and alarm. The house of Karnstein, he said, has been long extinct, 100 years at least. My dear wife was maternally descended from the Karnsteins, but the name and title have long ceased to exist. The castle is a ruin. The very village is deserted. It is 50 years since the smoke of a chimney was seen there, not a roof left. Quite true. I have heard a great deal about that since I last saw you, a great deal that will astonish you. But I had better relate everything in the order in which it occurred, said the general. You saw my dear ward, my child I may call her. No creature could have been more beautiful, and only 3 months ago none more blooming. Yes, poor thing, when I saw her last she certainly was quite lovely, said my father. I was grieved and shocked more than I can tell you, my dear friend. I knew what a blow it was to you. He took the general's hand, and they exchanged a kind pressure. Tears gathered in the old soldier's eyes. He did not seek to conceal them. Oh, he said, we have been very old friends. I knew you would feel for me, childless as I am. She had become an object of very near interest to me, and repaid my care by an affection that cheered my home and made my life happy. That is all gone. The years that remain to me on earth may not be very long, but by God's mercy I hope to accomplish a service to mankind before I die, and to subserve the vengeance of heaven upon the fiends who have murdered my poor child in the spring of her hopes and beauty. You said just now that you intended relating everything as it occurred, said my father. Pray do. I assure you that it is not mere curiosity that prompts me. So I think something that Dad heard from the doctor is lining up with something General Spielsdorf is saying. And that's why he's suddenly interested, and he's not, like, looking at him like he's insane again. He's like, oh, maybe you're not insane with your talk of monsters and heaven and hell. By this time we had reached the point at which Drunstall Road, by which the general had come, diverges from the road which we were traveling to Karnstein. How far is it to the ruins? Inquired the general, looking anxiously forward. About 1/2 league, answered my father. Pray, let us hear the story you were so good as to promise. And we will hear that story next time on Vampire Read-Throughs. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and to be continued. for supporting Vampire Read-Throughs. Patreon patrons, YouTube watchers, Twitter followers, Facebook fans. You all are great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Please leave me comments for the algorithm. Let me know what you think about the story. Let me know about your headcanons. I want to hear them all. Give me those Carmilla deep dives. Please, I live for them.